So moving on to the Zongshen pit bike motor for a second here. First thing I wanted to do, of course, is I got to figure out a crank trigger, and it already has this trigger that goes to the CDI to tell CDI to spark. And I hooked it up in the same way it was hooked up in the Briggs, but I wasn't getting a signal. And I kind of expected that. The reason being that they're two different kinds of sensors. This one has 2 wires. Typically 2 wires means it's what's called a variable reluctance sensor, which is a fancy way of saying it generates a current when the magnet goes by it. So in this case, we need a couple of things to make that happen and work. First thing we need is this small board here, which says DSC on it. This is a conditioner, which basically takes a signal from this, which again is a variable voltage, and turns it into a square wave pulse, so that the ECU can actually identify it as a crank signal or a trigger signal. So that was the first thing we needed to do, and the second thing, of course, was to wire it up and use slightly different pins. With the Hall sensor, which is what was on the Briggs 206, which was fired by a magnet too, and we had 3 pins. We had a ground, we had a 5 volts, and we had a signal. With the variable reluctance, we just have basically a minus pin, and we have a signal pin. So we're using the same signal pin and then what's called a VR, variable reluctance minus pin. Hook those 2 up onto the harness here, and you can see on the wire here we've got a blue white and a green white, blue white and green white, and these are the 2 that I can use for RPM/crank position. And the good thing about that too is that if we got a flywheel that has a trigger pattern, let's say like a 12-3, like the Honda Grom, we could use the same trigger to trigger that to have accurate crank timing for ignition. Right now, with a single trigger, there's just a single magnet on the flywheel. You can't control ignition with that. You can only control fuel. So that's something further down the line, but it's good to know that we can, literally just piggyback off those 2 wires in the harness, send it to this ECU, and we will have a crank signal. So it's one less sensor I have to wire up separately, and additionally, I was kind of worried that I might have to put a second sensor into the casing of the crank, or into the casing of around the stator, basically to pick up, and that would be a problem because it is surrounded by this and the magnet, so it'd be a bit more involved to get inside there. It sits like that, I think, or is it like that? Either way, it'd be more hassle. So there you go. Good shit.